But just to say, Minister, I accept completely and totally your bona fide and genuine approach to the question of traveller ethnicity, and it was indeed a momentous evening when we celebrated the recognition of travellers as an ethnic group. And I remember spending most of my time out of the gate trying to get more of them in. We were squashing them into the gallery and unfortunately couldn't get them in, couldn't get enough space for them. And one of them I just want to say I'm very proud of. She didn't come here today because she got so fed up not getting in the last night. Eileen Flynn last week completed her degree course in Maynooth. One of two traveller women who've gone to college and completed their course in Ballyfermot. So we can be proud of these kind of results, but I have to say we have a long way to go. And I just noticed a couple of things on this, on your speech, and I want to flesh out a small argument without being overly critical of you as an individual, but a small argument that I can't help to try and flesh out. First of all, I was reading back, but just over a year ago, Ronnie Fay of Pavy Point addressed the Committee on Housing and Homelessness on the traveller accommodation issue. And just a couple of things she said. Between 2008 and 2013, the traveller accommodation budget was cut from 40 million to 4 million, a staggering 90%. Even more shockingly, there was an underspend of 36% of the allocated traveller accommodation by local authorities. Now, at that period, I was chairing the LTACC in Dublin City Council. And unbeknownst to us, the Dublin City Council Housing Department refused or failed, one or the other, I would say, a bit of both, to draw down the total funding that was allocated to them by the Department of the Environment for housing. And it became obvious to me when this was repeated in budgetary, if you don't spend the budget one year, you get less of a budget the next year, and if you don't spend all that, you get less of the next. So they kind of justified to themselves why they were able to, even in the absence of austerity, drop the traveller accommodation budget to this limit. Secondly, she did go on to explain the level of accommodation crises among the travelling community. Some 361 traveller families are on unauthorised sites. 188 families lived in basic service bays. I'm sure you're familiar with them, where you can plug into electricity sometimes, where you might have access to plumbed water sometimes, but certainly it's not always the case that you'll have both or either in these sites. 182 families shared permanent halting sites and 17 shared basic services or transient halting sites. Now, this figure is startling. Roughly 5,500 or 18.6% of the traveller population are in need of proper accommodation provision. And using the census 2011 figures, we have another census since then, this would be equivalent of 853,500 of the general population. Almost 1 million people would be in need of proper housing. So we have a housing crisis, we all know this, but we have an extreme housing crisis among the traveller population. And although, Minister, I'm going to come to my argument here, and although I note in your presentation, which I welcome, you repeat 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times that we have to accept recognition with no implications for public expenditure, for legislation or any legislative amendments. We are, however, developing an action plan to tackle and seek to solve the problems facing the traveller community and working with travellers to do so. Well, I really do want to argue that if you're going to take any action, there has to be money spent, because you cannot address the enormity of that problem of 1 million people almost, 1 million people, there's not 1 million travellers, but that level of travelling, if that equivalent in the general population, among the traveller population, having such a crisis without spending money. And by God, does this government have to justify spending money on the traveller population? It absolutely behoves us to spend money on them, because we've starved them and underfunded them to a disgraceful degree, and particularly over the years of austerity. I won't go over the facts about the years of austerity and how it unjustly and in an unbalanced way hit travellers more than any other section of the population. But I do remember the criticism, when the criticism was made to the Minister for Finance, Michael Noonan, at the time. I'll never forget his words. And he said, we have to pluck the low-hanging fruit first. And by that he meant another way of saying it's easier to go after the most vulnerable, it's easier to go after those who are most exposed and what they have from, and you'll get less of a kickback from them. We have to pluck the low-hanging fruit first. And indeed, to our shame and eternal shame, if we have done this, then it is that set of the community that we have to now look after and ensure that they get their rights. I will say that, God help us, Caoimhín O'Quail, I don't know how you stuck 20 years in this place, but you did, and you've made a great achievement that you recently got this through. And, you know, you've played a fine role for 20 years in the House. But I will say this, for the 5 years that I chaired the LTACC, I learned a lot about how the and where it's not necessarily that I sit across the table from, you know, a city manager or officials in the Department of Housing in Dublin City Council who absolutely hate travellers or think they're all smelly or something. That's not the case. It is built into the system to use discrimination as a tool by which not to spend money, not to pay attention, not to deal with real problems. Because your life is made easier if you're working in these jobs, not to tackle the depth and the breadth of the problems that these communities face. And it's easier to send somebody into a halting site and say, yeah, well, there's too much antisocial behaviour in here, we can't repair the doors, or we can't give them we can't fix their electricity, or we can't give them the running water that they require. It's easier to do that, and you get away with doing it to travellers in a halting site or in a place that I'm most familiar with, like Labbert Park and Ballyfermot, or indeed St Margaret's and Ballymun. So I think that the attitude of the state, of the system, the systemic kind of inbuilt attitude to the travelling community is going to have to be dug out in a serious way, and the best way of doing that is to begin to change our legislative and structural framework and how we deal with it. So, for example, in the same contribution, Pavy Point recommend the establishment of a statutory traveller agency with travellers involved in it to deal with the traveller accommodation crisis. Therefore, you would probably not need the local area traveller committees like I sat on, or the National Traveller Committee like we all walked out of over a year ago in disgust because they were failing, utterly failing, to deal with the national traveller accommodation issue. I believe they're not having an AGM this year, but rather they're travelling around the country consulting with different communities. So I think it makes absolute sense to replace those two bodies because they have utterly failed, but to create a statutory agency that has powers of spending, of creating budgets and of delivering on the needs, the accommodation needs of the traveller community. And likewise, I think similar will have to be done with education and health. And if that requires legislative changes, you know, ethnicity doesn't require it, but the implications of dealing with all these things correctly should require the review of the 1998 Traveller Accommodation Act, for example, the Trespass Act, for example, and a whole plethora of legislative and corrective issues in local authorities as well as nationally. I'm very keen to see what the NITRIS report says when we come back here on the 13th of June. And I think we should look at it carefully. Local traveller activists, whom I must say are amazing, the finest people I've ever met in my life, and this is not patronising, is to say that those, both traveller and non-traveller, who work with the traveller communities are extremely impressive people, very dedicated, very decent people, and really have achieved this final result. Although Deputy O'Quail helped them through, and others, it has really, as been already said, down to the activism to have achieved the recognition. And as I say, I look forward to the implementation of this. But we owe it to the travelling community, the body politic, all of us owe it to the travelling community to undo the injustices that have been imposed on them down through the decades in this state.